Tonight, we begin at the edge of the sea, where a gray island waits behind weather. To the peoples of the warm Mediterranean world, the northern land beyond the Channel once seemed less like a country than a rumor. It was said to be cold, damp, and stubborn, a place where mist drifted over grasslands, where old stones stood in silence, where tribes lived under a sky that felt farther from the sun. Long before it would be called the United Kingdom, long before it would gather crowns, parliaments, empires, and arguments, it was simply a piece of earth standing apart, half imagined. That is where our story should begin, not with a king's silk, not with a battle standard, not with the sound of church bells or factory whistles, but with a shoreline. Waves touch pebbles, then slide away. Wind presses through tall grass. Somewhere inland, fires burn low in places no map has yet recorded. The island is there, patient and unhurried, receiving one generation after another, long before anyone can agree on what it is. Over the course of the night, we will watch this quiet land change its shape again and again. We will see forests cut back, roads laid down, ships arrive, castles rise, chimneys darken the sky, trenches open, cities rebuild, and old identities shed their skins only to discover that something older still remains beneath. Yet through all of it, one thread will stay constant. Whenever the island changes, ordinary people must learn once more how to live upon it. They must learn where to sleep, what to eat, whom to trust, what to fear, and how to make a life under a new sky that is somehow the same sky as before. So let us leave behind the noise of modern headlines for a while. Let us step back from names we already know. Let us walk to a time before the kingdom, before the language, before the flags, and before the idea of Britain itself had fully formed. Out there in the deep distance of prehistory, the island is waiting for us, quiet as breath on cold air. If we go back far enough, the island stops feeling like an island at all. The sea that now separates Britain from the continent had not yet fully claimed its place. There were colder ages when great sheets of ice shaped the north, and there were milder intervals when animals and human groups could move across broad stretches of land that later disappeared beneath the water. In that older world, movement was everything. Herds moved, rivers shifted, shorelines changed, and people followed what they could hunt, gather, remember, and survive. The earliest lives here were lived close to the ground. They were lives of stone edges, sharpened wood, smoke-darkened shelter, animal paths, and watchfulness. Survival depended on noticing small things, a print in mud, a change in wind, the call of birds lifting suddenly from reeds, the color of the sky before the weather turned. There were no cities to hide in, and no fields waiting obediently behind hedges. There was only landscape, and the need to understand it before nightfall. For long periods, the people moving through this northern world were not settling in a later sense of the word. They were passing through favorable places, returning to known shelter, leaving behind tools and traces more often than graves or written memory. This is why so much of their story survives in fragments. A worked flake of flint, a hand axe dulled by use, the rare survival of a wooden spear preserved where wet ground protected it from time. These remnants may look small to us, but they contain a whole style of living. They tell us that hands made, repaired, and improvised. They tell us that bodies move through cold places with purpose. They tell us that people learned the rhythm of this land long before they could name it. Imagine the British landscape in one of those older ages. Thick woodland in some regions, open ground in others, cold rivers, marshy edges, and roaming animals that no longer belong to modern Britain. Reindeer in certain periods, wild cattle, boar, deer, creatures large enough to feed a group and dangerous enough to kill the hunter who misjudged a single step. In such a place, every successful hunt was not just food. It was warmth, clothing, tools, and another stretch of time bought from the dark. And yet even this hard life was not without pattern or beauty. Seasons taught repetition, camps were remembered, caves, overhangs, and sheltered places became familiar. As the climate warmed after severe cold phases, trees spread, grasses returned, and new hunting grounds opened. Humans adjusted again, as they always would. They followed the change, and the change taught them how to remain alive. That may be the oldest lesson in the whole history of Britain. Before there were laws, before there were roads, before there was a country, there was adaptation. The land moved first, and people answered. As the centuries passed, those answers became more skilled. Stoneworking grew more refined, hunting habits changed with the animals available. Groups learned where the coast offered abundance, where inland woods gave shelter, where rivers could guide movement. The island, or almost island, was already beginning to shape habits of return. Not permanence yet, but familiarity, not ownership, but knowledge. And in that slow-growing familiarity, the first foundation of later British life was quietly being laid. As the land softened and human knowledge deepened, life in Britain began to gather around repeating acts. A camp was no longer just a brief interruption in motion. It could become a remembered place. Fires were lit in familiar shelter. Food was prepared in known ways. Paths were retraced when a season returned. The people of this age still moved, but they were no longer wandering through complete uncertainty. They had begun to build memory into the landscape. There is something profoundly intimate about these early routines. At the center of them is fire. Fire for warmth, for light, for safety, for cooking, for comfort at the edge of a dark that must have felt immense. Around that fire, someone repaired a tool, someone stripped meat from bone, someone listened for weather, someone watched children sleep. If we listen carefully, prehistory is not only a story of danger and migration, it is also a story of repeated domestic gestures so old that they almost disappear from view. On milder days, groups likely moved out with purpose that had been practiced many times before. Certain grounds favored deer, certain water margins yielded fish or shellfish, certain seasons made coastal living more attractive, while harsher months pushed people back toward more protected places. Britain taught flexibility. Remain too long in one place and resources thin out. Move too quickly, and you leave security behind. The answer was rhythm. Winter camp, summer camp, return when the land has had time to renew itself. In that sense, these communities were already mastering a quiet kind of economy, one based on attention rather than ownership. The tools they left behind show how skilled that attention became. Small flakes shaped for precise uses, heavier hand tools worn by repeated cutting, implements made not for display, but for the thousand practical needs of bodily life. And while later ages would admire grand monuments, these older objects tell us something even more fundamental. They reveal human patience. To shape a useful edge from stone is to trust that care matters. To carry or remake such tools again and again is to participate in a world where survival depends on competence shared across generations. There was also a growing closeness between people and the sea. As post-glacial Britain changed, coastal sites offered rich food and seasonal opportunity. Fish, shellfish, and marine resources entered the diet more deeply. The shore was no longer only a border, it was a provider, a route, and a teacher. Tides create their own clock, and perhaps that too influenced the people who lived beside them. Later, Britain would become a maritime power, but long before fleets and ports, there were already human beings reading the water for signs of nourishment. If we slow the scene even further, we can picture a late evening beside one of those camps. The day's labor has quieted, tools rest near hands that shaped them. Smoke rises through cool air. The hunt may have gone well, or perhaps not well enough, and tomorrow must make up the difference. Yet even here, there is a sense of belonging beginning to form. The land is no longer entirely strange. It is difficult, but known. That difference is everything, and this is where an important sleep story truth begins to shimmer through the history. Again and again, Britain becomes most understandable, not when power speaks, But when daily life settles into view, a person warming hands, a family sharing shelter, a group learning when to leave and when to come back. These are quiet images, but they carry great weight because the larger history to come will grow out of them. In time, the camps will become settlements, the repeated paths will become roads, and the fragile familiarity of place will deepen into something more lasting. Very slowly, people on this land will begin not only to return to it, but to keep it. The shift from moving through the land to shaping the land was not sudden, but once it gathered force, it altered everything. Farming entered Britain as part of a much wider change, moving across Europe, and with it came a different relationship to time. Hunters can follow the season. Farmers must wait on it. Seeds ask for patience. Animals kept alive ask for care day after day. A field cleared from woodland is a promise to the future. It says that someone intends to remain. So the old Britain of camps and repeated returns slowly gave way to a new Britain of settled labor. Trees were cut back with better tools. Open ground widened. Small clearings became more organized. Barley and early wheat were planted. Cattle and pigs were bred and washed rather than merely pursued. Food could now be planned for, stored, and measured differently. That did not make life easy, but it made it more rooted. Households were no longer simply where a group stopped. They were places built to endure. The houses themselves tell part of the story. Long timber structures rose where people expected to spend extended seasons and perhaps many years. Families could gather under roofs that were not temporary answers to weather, but investments in continuity. Nearby, the dead were given more deliberate forms of remembrance. Burial structures and ceremonial spaces became part of the lived landscape. To dwell somewhere fully is to anchor memory there, and early farming Britain was doing exactly that. The living worked the land, the dead remained within it. The future would pass through both. Agriculture also changed the emotional texture of life. A hunter's world can be sudden and uncertain. A farming world carries its own anxieties, but they are different. Will the grain come up well? Will the herd survive winter? Will stored food last long enough? Will the weather destroy what patient hands have built? These are slower worries, tied to long cycles rather than sharp moments. They also produce slower forms of hope. A field planted in spring asks to be imagined months ahead. A young animal kept through the year becomes a small investment in security. Across Britain, this long seasonal thinking began to settle into the minds of its people. And once people became more deeply settled, they began reshaping the social world too. Labor had to be coordinated, land had to be divided or at least informally understood. Knowledge of when to plant, when to reap, when to slaughter, and how to preserve had to be passed down and trusted. Tools became more specialized. Craft and custom took firmer hold. Communities learned to depend not only on individual skill, but on continuity across generation. A child born into one of these early settlements entered a world that had already been arranged by the patient work of others. If we look out over Britain now in this era, we no longer see only a wild northern edge. We see patches of order emerging from woodland. We see smoke from houses rising in places where people expect to be tomorrow and next year. We see paths trodden more often between the same points. We see the beginnings of local worlds. Nothing yet resembles the later kingdom, but one of the deepest foundations has been laid. Britain is becoming a lived landscape, not just a crossed one. There is also a softening of the human relationship with mortality here, or at least a deepening of ritual. The dead are not simply lost to the elements, they are gathered into structures of memory. The land of the living and the land of the dead begin to overlap. This matters because British history will keep returning to the idea that the past remains physically present. In burial mounds, standing stones, ruined abbeys, old roads, blackened mills, warmer memorials, and modern cemeteries, the island will continue storing memory in the ground. That instinct is already visible now. Perhaps we can imagine an evening in one of those early farming settlements. The tools are hung up, grain is stored, the animals settle. The fire is more dependable now, because the house around it is more dependable. Outside, beyond the edge of cultivated land, the old wilder Britain still waits in shadow. Wolves may still move there, deer still cross the woods, rain still soaks the earth, yet inside the clearing there is a new confidence, quiet but real. People are no longer only surviving the land, they are beginning to persuade it into partnership. And once that partnership begins, imagination begins to change as well. The people who stay long enough in one place start to ask different questions. They look more closely at the sky over the same horizon. They mark the seasons with greater care. They invest meaning in the shape of the ground. The next great turn in Britain's story will grow from that settled attention, when labor, ritual, and landscape begin to circle one another in forms that still fascinate the modern mind. When people think of ancient Britain, their minds often travel first to stone. Not ordinary stone, but arranged stone, stone lifted, placed, aligned, and made to stand under the wide sky with a seriousness that seems to outlast language. Circles, banks, ditches, ceremonial grounds, and the famous monument on Salisbury Plain all speak of a people no longer content merely to survive their world. They wanted to interpret it. They wanted to gather beneath the heavens and make meaning visible. This was the Britain of ritual landscapes, where labor was spent not only on food and shelter, but on monuments whose full purpose still resists certainty. That mystery is part of their power. A ditch dug inward rather than outward suggests something other than defense. The careful relation between stone and sky suggests observation, ceremony, remembrance, or all three at once. Perhaps the important thing is not to solve these places too quickly. Their quiet authority lies partly in the fact that they still ask us to approach them slowly. They belong to a rhythm of attention rather than a rush toward explanation. Daily life continued, of course. Pottery evolved. Storage improved. Brewing and shared meals likely mattered more than we often imagine. The same hands that raised monuments also needed, carved, carried, and tended. Ancient Britain was not divided into a practical world and a sacred world. They met in the same bodies, on the same ground. The person who looked at the stars for signs of season might also be the person mending a tool at dawn. The people who gathered at ceremonial sites still returned home to ordinary hunger and ordinary fatigue. Then came metal, first bronze and later iron, and with each step the island changed again. Metal did not erase the older world, but it sharpened it. Tools lasted longer, weapons became more durable, ornament could be cast with new elegance, wealth and skill became visible in different ways. Land boundaries seemed to harden during these ages. Social distinctions become easier to imagine. Some areas show signs of intensified farming, stronger local authority, and more formalized defense. In the later prehistoric centuries, Britain begins to feel less like a scattered collection of adaptations and more like a patchwork of communities conscious of territory, exchange, and status. The Bronze Age carries a faint glow in the imagination, perhaps because bronze itself seems warm even when cold. One can picture blades, pins, vessels, and ornaments catching the weak light of a smoky interior. But beneath that glow, there was tension too. Valuable resources rarely move without shaping human relationships around them. Trade routes mattered, skilled metalworkers mattered, access to ore and finished goods mattered. A society that can make better tools can also make better weapons. And the line between prestige and fear grows thinner. By the Iron Age, that tension deepens further. Ironworking offers greater resilience and broader practical reach. Hilltop enclosures and fortified places tell us that some communities were thinking seriously about defense, status, and authority. Tribal identities strengthen. The peoples later known through Roman and Greek accounts as Celts were not one unified nation in the modern sense, but they helped form the texture of Iron Age Britain through language, art, social structure, and a way of occupying the land that would leave long echoes. This was a Britain of tribal territories, cultivated fields, defended heights, and highly developed local worlds connected by exchange and rivalry. And yet, even here, the story remains most powerful when we remember the ordinary pace beneath the larger pattern. Someone still had to feed animals. Someone still repaired roofs after rain. Children still grew up learning local paths and local customs. Food still simmered. Fire still burned. Evening still came down over the same rolling ground. The great changes of prehistory were real, but they were lived one day at a time, one field at a time, one household at a time. There's another important truth hidden in this age. Britain was learning to organize itself without becoming singular. Even in later centuries, the island would keep returning to this condition. Many local identities held within a larger frame that was not always stable. Prehistoric ritual sites, bronze wealth, iron authority, and tribal boundaries all whisper the same idea. This land does not become one thing easily. It gathers layers. It accumulates meanings. It resists simplification. So if we stand for a moment among standing stones, or on a wind-brushed rise above a defended enclosure, we can feel the island becoming denser with intention. People have moved beyond mere adaptation. They are storing power in ritual, in metal, in land, and in memory. They are preparing, without knowing it, for a new encounter. Far to the south, beyond the sea, a different civilization is organizing itself around roads, armies, cities, and imperial ambition. One day, that world will look northward, and when it does, Britain will no longer be only the land of stones and tribes. It will become a frontier in someone else's imagination. To Roman eyes, the island beyond the Channel was both temptation and inconvenient. It lay close enough to matter and far enough to remain uncertain. Merchants moved between Britain and the opposite shore. Stories traveled too. There were hints of wealth, of tribes, of strange customs, of political usefulness. And for ambitious men in Rome, the very uncertainty of Britain could make it attractive. A place half known is often easier to imagine as a prize. When Roman leaders first turned serious attention toward the island, the encounter was uneasy and incomplete. Expeditions could land, threaten, negotiate, and withdraw. But full domination required more than boldness. It required patience, logistics, and the imperial habit of returning. Eventually, that habit prevailed. Legions crossed in strength. Local powers were challenged, bargained with, or crushed. And bit by bit, Britain was drawn into the Roman world. It is easy to picture conquest only in terms of marching men and battlefield dust. But Rome's deeper influence worked through structure. Once the imperial machine settled, it organized. Roads spread across the landscape with a confidence that prehistoric paths had never possessed. Towns developed or expanded according to a different idea of order. Administrative centers, military zones, markets, and baths appeared. Britain did not become Roman overnight, and never became it completely, but many parts of life were now measured against Roman system. Londinium, the city that would one day become London, began as part of this vast reordering. It was not yet the imperial capital of later fantasy, but it belonged to a network larger than any Britain had known. Trade thickened, taxation pressed, grain production intensified, mining and extraction became more systematized. Latin entered official space. Local elites could find advantage in cooperation. Resistance remained, sometimes violently, but the long shadow of empire settled over daily life. This was also the age when Roman Britain learned the paradox of imperial peace. Conquest could be brutal, yet once secured, it often brought a form of stability valuable to those willing or forced to live beneath it. Roads made travel more predictable. Markets connected distant places. Urban amenities reshaped expectations. Bathhouses offered warmth and social life. Written administration made authority feel more permanent. The empire was heavy, but it was legible. Of course, not everyone experienced that weight in the same way. Some saw improved trade and opportunity. Others saw tribute, occupation, and humiliation. Tribal leaders who resisted could be erased or folded into imperial logic. Sacred spaces encountered foreign habits. Landscapes long understood locally were redrawn by imperial need. Still, the ordinary person living in Roman Britain may have experienced the change most clearly in smaller forms. A newly built road nearby, different goods in the market, a fortified place on the horizon, a tax collector, a language heard in official matters, a shift in what power looked like. There were moments of fierce opposition. Local revolts flared. Roman rule was never universally loved, and the memory of resistance would survive long after immediate defeats. Yet, the empire had endurance on its side. It could absorb, rebuild, and resume. Towns destroyed could rise again. Administrative routines could reassert themselves. Britain became not only a conquered edge, but a functioning province within a much wider world. And that wider world changed the scale of imagination. Prehistoric and tribal Britain had known exchange, ritual, and hierarchy, but Rome connected the island to an immense imperial horizon stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. A road in Britain now belonged conceptually to a system whose logic extended far beyond local memory. That is an extraordinary shift. The island had once seemed distant even in rumor. Now it was threaded into empire. Still, even empire must eventually sleep. Behind the Roman facade of order lay real bodies growing tired, carrying goods, mending walls, harvesting fields, standing watch in damp weather, and learning to live under rules they did not invent. And it is there, in that more ordinary texture, that we should linger next, because the deepest Roman mark on Britain may not have been a victory at all, but the quieter habits that conquest left behind. Once the legions had done their dramatic work, life in Roman Britain settled into routines that were less visible and perhaps more powerful. Roads linked important places with a firmness the island had never known before. Goods moved with greater regularity. Messages could travel along planned lines. Settlements that had once depended on local patterns were now drawn into wider circuits of supply and exchange. Even if a peasant never walked farther than nearby fields and market roads, the structure around that life had changed. Imagine a morning in this quieter Roman Britain. Wagons creak over hard road surfaces. Traders approach a town gate with pottery, grain, cloth, and metal goods. Steam drifts above public baths. Soldiers, clerks, local laborers, craftspeople, and farmers all participate in a world more ordered than the one their ancestors knew. Some embrace it, some endure it, but either way, habit begins to grow around it, and habit is one of the strongest materials in history. The countryside too was altered by this long occupation. Agriculture became more productive in some regions, especially where the imperial presence encouraged regular extraction and supply. Villas and more organized estates appeared in certain places, signaling local wealth shaped partly by Roman taste. Towns became centers, not only of trade, but of a new kind of urban imagination. To live near such a place was to live near stonework, drainage, planning, and official presence. Even those on the margins had to reckon with it. Religion changed in texture as well. The Roman world was flexible in some ways, absorbing local cults, introducing foreign gods, and later, as Christianity spread, helping to shift the spiritual atmosphere of Europe and Britain alike. The island remained layered, not erased. Old places retained power and memory. New practices entered beside them. Roman Britain was not simple replacement, it was accumulation. That accumulation is perhaps why Rome mattered so much. It taught Britain how durable systems could feel. It taught the island the weight of roads, walls, administration, and urban identity. It introduced a style of living in which one could expect things to arrive, to function, to continue, for centuries afterward. Even after imperial withdrawal, people would live among the leftovers of this order. A broken road is still a road. A ruined wall still suggests the idea of boundary. A city once planned still bends future lives around it. And for the ordinary inhabitants, Roman rule may have become almost ordinary in the end. Children were born into it without remembering the before. Markets operated, taxes were grumbled over, repairs were made, fields were plowed, towns were rebuilt when needed. The empire felt distant and present at once, like weather sent from elsewhere, but lived under at home. That is often how large powers are experienced by common people. Not as speeches from capitals, but as routine. So when Rome eventually weakened and its grasp loosened, the shock was not only political, it was practical. What happens when habit loses its master? What happens when the roads remain, but the system behind them fades? What happens when a province grows used to being part of something larger, and then finds itself more alone than before? Britain would soon learn that answer. But for one last quiet moment, we can rest in the stillness of Roman order. A paved road after rain. A warm bath in cool weather. A market humming softly. A household finishing its day under a world that seems, for now, stable. When Roman authority thinned and finally withdrew, Britain did not become empty, but it did become quieter in a new way. The large system that had connected road to tax, town to empire, and province to distant center no longer stood firmly behind daily life. The island fractured into smaller political worlds. Local powers rose. Some places declined, others adapted. Ruins stayed where they were, but the confidence that built them had gone. This is the beginning of the world we often call Anglo-Saxon Britain, though even that phrase covers many communities and centuries of change. What matters first is not a label, but a shift in scale. Britain becomes more local again. Great imperial structure gives way to halls. Households, village rhythms, regional loyalties, and the slow work of making life hold together without Rome. This is not merely decline, it is rearrangement. The homes of the period were warmer in feeling than their simplicity might suggest. Timber walls, thatched roofs, earthen floors, smoke rising from a central hearth. Several generations could live in close proximity, their labor intertwined. The hall mattered not only as a building but as a social idea, a center of gathering, obligation, storytelling, and mutual recognition. Fire returned to symbolic prominence. If Roman order had often expressed itself through roads and walls, post-Roman order gathered more intimately around flame, kinship, and food. Agriculture remained central, as it had to. Fields had to be worked, animals tended, grain stored, trees cut, fences mended, tools repaired. Children helped where they could. Skilled workers appeared within communities too. Blacksmiths, woodworkers, leatherworkers. People whose craft gave shape to ordinary necessity. In this sense, Britain after Rome was not primitive compared with what came before. It was practical in a different register. It was building society at a human scale. The emotional atmosphere of the age also changed. Without a strong, overarching empire, insecurity could deepen. Raids, rivalries, shifting borders, and unstable leadership made local belonging more important. People would have known their world through immediate ties, the lord they served, the village they worked in, the patch of land they depended on, the church or sacred custom that framed time, the regional kingdom whose fortunes might rise or fall around them. History, for most people, came very close to home, yet there is something deeply restful in this closer scale if we do not rush past it. Listen to the smaller sounds of the age. A dog moving around livestock at dawn, a wooden bowl set down on a table, rain touching a roof of straw, a child learning the fields by walking them, a blacksmith striking iron while conversation drifts nearby. These are not the sounds of imperial grandeur, but they are the sounds out of which continuity is made. Language, too, was changing the feel of the island. New speech communities formed the basis of what would one day grow into English. Words for everyday things, household things, weather things, law things, relationship things, took root and stayed. Britain was learning to speak itself differently. That matters more than we sometimes notice, because language is one of the ways a land becomes emotionally inhabitable. A road can be built from stone, but a country is also built from repeated words. At the same time, Christianity spread and deepened in many areas, linking local life to broader religious worlds, while also anchoring time through ritual, feast days, and moral structure. The old island of stones and tribal territories was becoming a land of villages, halls, churches, and patchwork kingdoms. It was still many things at once, but a new texture had emerged, intimate, laboring, and conscious of belonging. And perhaps that is the strange grace of Britain after Rome. It lost scale, but gained closeness. It became easier to imagine the ordinary person within it. You can picture a family sleeping under one roof, tools near the wall, embers dimming, tomorrow's work already waiting. In ages of grand transformation, that image mattered. It reminds us that a country is never only made from the top. It is remade nightly in homes, but the sea remained there, and the sea always keeps an opening. Across it, in colder northern lands, other communities knew ships, hardship, ambition, and opportunity. They too would look toward Britain in time, and when they came, they would first arrive, like a storm, at the edge of this smaller, hearth-lit world. The first sight of the longboats must have felt like the return of something ancient and newly terrifying at once. Dark shapes on water, oars cutting rhythm into the sea, men arriving not by road, not by local custom, but from the open horizon. The Viking Age in Britain begins in fear, because that is how many communities first experienced it. Coastal monasteries and settlements were exposed, wealth gathered in sacred spaces made easy targets. The sea, which could nourish and connect, could also deliver violence without warning. Yet, as with so many things in British history, the first form of a change was not its final one. Raiding came before settlement in many places, but settlement followed. The newcomers from Scandinavia did not remain forever as figures of pure disturbance. They established themselves, ruled territory, traded, intermarried, shaped towns, and left traces far deeper than the early scenes of plunder suggest. Britain did not merely suffer the Viking presence, it absorbed and was changed by it. Part of the reason this period remains so powerful is that it holds two emotional tones at once. On one hand, there is urgency. Kingdoms were threatened. Existing powers bent under pressure. Great leaders rose in response. On the other hand, there is a slower transformation unfolding beneath the raids. The building of new legal habits, new speech patterns, new relationships to land and town. This second current matters just as much, perhaps more. The area later known as the Danelaw stands as one of the clearest signs of this deeper change. Here, Viking influence was not a passing blow, but an organizing force. Towns developed, law and custom took on northern shapes. Trade continued. Boundaries were negotiated. The island learned, once again, that enemies can become neighbors, and neighbors can become part of the future. That is not a comfortable lesson, but it is one Britain would learn repeatedly. The famous contests of the age, especially those involving the kings of Wessex and the Scandinavian leaders pressing into England, have rightly drawn attention for centuries. But for sleep story purposes, what matters most is the atmosphere beneath them. Imagine villages adjusting to new rulers. Imagine names changing. Imagine children growing up hearing more than one tongue in the market. Imagine familiar places being claimed by new customs, then gradually becoming normal again. History is often remembered as a sequence of shocks, but it is lived through accommodation. Even the English language carries the calm evidence of this age. Everyday words, practical words, words that move through domestic life without ceremony, owe something to Old Norse influence. That is a lovely detail, because it means the Viking inheritance did not remain confined to swords and sagas. It entered the kitchen, the street, the weather, the law, ordinary speech itself. A people once feared from the sea became part of the island's daily vocabulary. There is also a social softness that emerges if we let the story breathe. Trade resumed and deepened, craft continued, marriage crossed older lines. The old binary of invader and native begins to blur. In some regions, Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon communities lived not in constant drama, but in practical coexistence. They worked, bargained, raised families, and buried their dead under the same weather. For almost any age of conquest, that is the quieter truth that comes after the loud one. This does not mean the period lacked blood or grief. It did, but if we stay only with burning monasteries and famous battles, we miss the most enduring layer. Britain was being remade again through contact, negotiation, and mixture. Another inheritance was entering the island and refusing to leave. And the island, true to form, was not becoming simpler under that pressure. It was becoming more layered. Perhaps we can picture a northern town on an ordinary day during this era. Goods changing hands, boats tied up, smoke rising, a craftsman speaking one language to a customer and another at home. A law dispute handled according to habits that would have seemed foreign not long before. A child bearing a name that carries more than one world inside it. These are calm images, but they show history settling. Eventually, the old Viking political dominance in England weakened, fractured, and was pushed back. Yet the presence itself did not vanish. The sea that had brought danger also brought inheritance. And by the time the age had passed, Britain was no longer a land merely visited by Scandinavians. It had become a land partly shaped by them. The next great conquest would come from elsewhere, but it would not land on untouched soil. It would land on an island already made rich and complicated by previous arrivals. Then came the conquest that hardened power into stone. The Norman arrival in the 11th century is remembered for a famous battle, a fallen king, and a victor whose name would cling to the island for centuries. But the deepest change did not end on the battlefield. It began there. What followed was a remaking of authority so visible that even the landscape seemed to feel it. Norman rule announced itself materially. Castles rose in commanding places, not as shy additions to the land, but as declarations. Stone replaced much of the earlier softness of timber and earth in the architecture of domination. Great churches and cathedrals also grew, not only as religious buildings, but as embodiments of prestige, order, and permanence. If the Viking inheritance had often moved through language and settlement, the Norman inheritance could be seen from a distance. It towered. There is something psychologically important in that. A road can guide, a market can persuade, a castle can instruct without speaking. It tells everyone nearby where power resides. It tells them who claims the right to watch, judge, store, punish, protect, and endure. Norman England became a place where hierarchy acquired walls, staircases, keeps, and gates. Power had always existed, but now it occupied the skyline more insistently. Land ownership changed with cruel efficiency. Existing holders were displaced. Loyalty to the conqueror mattered more than older attachment. The Great Survey that later generations would know as the Domesday Book reveals the Norman impulse clearly. Count it, measure it, assign it, make it legible to authority. A country can be conquered by the sword, but to keep it, one must also inventory it. This was the colder genius of the new regime. Under feudal patterns, land, labor, and military service locked together in new ways. Lords held from the king, others held from them. Peasants worked beneath layers of authority not of their choosing. Obligations tightened, protection and burden were bound to one another. The shape of society became more vertical. For those near the top, this could mean privilege, prestige, and a place in a trans-channel world. For those below, it often meant that the fruits of work climbed upward while dependents stayed behind. Yet, as always, ordinary life continued beneath the larger frame. Peasants still planted, bakers still baked, animals still had to be led in and out of weather. Children still learned the world by walking around its edges. In some ways, this continuity makes the period even more poignant. A new castle may loom over the valley, but someone must still rise before dawn to tend pigs or patch a fence. History changes quickly from above and slowly from below. The church formed another great pillar of Norman order. Religious life had already long mattered in England, but the scale and style of Norman ecclesiastical building made faith feel more monumental. Cathedrals, abbeys, and monasteries gathered wealth, influence, and beauty. Stone vaulting and carved detail spoke of ambition directed heavenward, yet rooted in very worldly power. Clergy and nobles often moved within overlapping circles of influence. Salvation and administration lived near one another. Food, too, reflects the age in revealing ways. The diets of the wealthy could be rich, spiced, and ceremonially displayed. Feast culture helped distinguish rank. Meanwhile, common folk depended on humbler fare, preserved when necessary, repetitive when unavoidable, and closely tied to season and survival. This contrast belongs to the deeper, emotional truth of medieval England. The grandeur later romanticized in storybooks rested on unequal comfort. And still, one must not let the period flatten into oppression alone. Human life is too stubborn for that. Music sounded in halls. Stories were told, marriages were arranged and sometimes cherished. Market days brought movement and color. Religious festivals broke the monotony of labor. Even under heavy structures, people found ways to live with texture. That is another sleep-content gold vein in British history. The world is difficult, but still full of ordinary ceremony. If we stand at dusk below a Norman castle, perhaps we can feel the tension of the age. Above us, stone authority. Around us, cultivated land and village life. Beyond, roads and rivers carrying rumors, taxes, goods, and commands. The island is once again under a new discipline. Yet in the houses beneath, supper is still being set out, tools still cleaned, children still hushed towards sleep. Britain has changed. Ordinary life is learning how to bear the new shape. And beneath every arch and tower, that remains the story that matters most. If we want to understand medieval Britain without becoming trapped inside the biographies of rulers, the surest path is to lower our eyes from the crown to the ground. The ground is where most people live their entire history. It is where rent was demanded, where grain was threshed, where rain turned paths to mud, where taxes hurt, where plague entered, where hunger sharpened, where children learned their work young, and where almost every grand decision reached the body in the form of labor or fear. For the peasant and small tenant, life under medieval systems was rarely dramatic in the heroic sense, but it could be exhausting in a more durable way. Work followed the season relentlessly. Fields had to be plowed, sown, weeded, harvested, and protected. Animals required care in weather that was seldom gentle for long. Fuel had to be gathered, clothing patched, tools repaired, bread baked, ale brewed. The year was not measured by personal preference, but by agricultural necessity. To fall behind could mean real danger. Social obligations pressed from every direction. Some people owed labor directly, others owed rents, dues, or service. Some were freer than others. But freedom was uneven and fragile. The village was not merely a cluster of homes. It was a network of dependency, memory, scrutiny, and survival. Everyone knew who held land, who lacked it, who had lost a child, who had quarreled, who had failed to pay, who had prospered unexpectedly. In such a world, privacy was scarce, but belonging could be strong. The medieval church also structured time with remarkable force. Bells marked the day. Holy days interrupted the agricultural calendar with ritual, rest, or obligation, depending on one's place in society. Birth, marriage, confession, and burial all passed through a sacred frame. For many people, theology, its abstract form, may have mattered less than the repeated comfort and fear of religious routine. Candles, processions, feast days, fasting, the smell of incense, the dread of sin, the hope that suffering might carry meaning. These were emotional realities, not just doctrines. Meanwhile, the political world above ordinary life could be unstable in ways that made everyday burdens worse. Civil conflict, disputed inheritance, royal anger, and noble rivalry often translated downward into insecurity. Armies had to be supplied, taxes had to rise, local order could fracture. Castles and fortifications that symbolized protection could just as easily remind a population of control and violence. When kings and great lords struggled, the poor rarely watched from a distance. They paid in food, labor, fear, or blood. The development of law and political restraint is one of the age's most famous legacies, and rightly so. Charters, negotiated limits on royal power, and early parliamentary developments would later be celebrated as the foundations of constitutional life. Yet at the time, these changes were not experienced as tidy progress. They emerged from tension, bargaining, resentment, and crisis. Even when they benefited the realm in the long run, they did not instantly soften ordinary hardship. A legal idea can be born in a noble dispute and still take generations to reach the common hand with any gentleness. Then came plague, and with plague, the medieval world revealed both its fragility and its strange flexibility. Epidemic disease struck Britain as part of a broader catastrophe across Europe, and its effect was not only demographic but emotional and social. Death came too quickly, bodies accumulated, traditional explanations strained under the scale of loss. Entire communities were changed or broken. Those who survived encountered a world in which labor suddenly had different value because there were fewer laborers left to do it. This altered relationships between workers and masters, sometimes opening small space for bargaining, sometimes provoking harsh attempts to restore old control. That matters deeply. It reminds us that medieval Britain was not static. Even beneath rigid structures, change could come through suffering, scarcity, and demographic shock. Peasant resistance, rising demands, and unrest did not appear out of nowhere. They were part of a society under pressure, where the terms of ordinary life were being renegotiated, whether elites wished it or not. In such moments, the history of the island becomes especially intimate because large change grows directly out of the daily body. The field, the wage, the burial, the meal not eaten. Still, let us not leave the section only in severity. The medieval countryside also held familiar comforts. Wool drying near a hearth, a dog asleep by the door, a bowl of pottage warming slowly, summer light over strips of cultivated land, the relief of harvest brought in before rain, the brief brightness of fairs and festivals, the pleasure of music in a hall, or the murmur of gossip at market. Human beings do not wait for ideal conditions to live. They live inside the conditions they are given. That is why medieval life remains such rich material for a sleep script. It is repetitive, physical, close to weather, and full of textures that modern life has partly lost. And it helps us remember that the true continuity of British history is not royal succession, though that matters. It is the stubborn continuity of ordinary effort, hands in soil, bread from grain, fire in winter, hope measured a season at a time. As the Middle Ages wore on, England and the wider island would continue to change through war, law, disease, and dynastic struggle. But beneath the noise, the common pattern held. People endured, they adjusted, and when the next great national rewriting came, through the Tudors and their upheavals of faith and power, it would once again pass first. through ordinary rooms before it ever settled into national legend. The Tudor age is often presented as if history itself suddenly put on richer clothes. Portraits sharpen, courts glitter, famous personalities stride forward with dramatic appetites. Religion breaks and reforms. The monarchy seems intensely personal. Yet if we want to keep the tone of the night, it is better to treat the Tudor period not as theater alone, but as a national rearrangement felt in kitchens, parishes, schools, workshops, and private consciences. The dynasty emerged from the exhaustion that followed dynastic conflict, and for that reason, its promise carried unusual force. It suggested stability after fracture, a binding together of wounds that had bled the elite world for generations. But stability under the Tudors did not mean stillness. It meant change directed from above with remarkable energy. New marriages, new succession anxieties, new political calculations, and above all, a new religious path would alter the emotional weather of England. The break with Rome under Henry VIII is often told through the urgency of one king's desire for a secure male heir. But its deeper importance lies in how it redrew the sources of authority. When the English crown severed itself from papal supremacy and built a national church around royal power, people all across the kingdom had to relearn where sacred legitimacy lived. This was not merely an argument among scholars. It touched worship, ritual, law, property, and the tone of public life. Monasteries were dissolved, traditions altered, belief became politically dangerous in new ways. And still, while these grand matters unfolded, ordinary life continued. Bread had to be baked, fields worked, apprentices trained, children disciplined, illness tended without modern certainty. The Tudor household could be austere or lively depending on status and fortune, but it was still a place of repeated practical tasks. Women spun, cooked, cleaned, managed stores, mended, and raised children. Men worked land, craft, trade, or office depending on where they stood. Servants moved through larger houses in a disciplined choreography. Even in great change, daily necessity remained an anchor. That anchor is important because the Tudor age could otherwise feel too sharp for sleep content. It was an age of penalties, persecutions, and precarious favor. Yet beneath those tensions lay softer continuities. Candlelight in the evening, cloth drying near warmth, children learning letters where education reached them, parish life, organizing neighbors into shared rituals, seasonal foods arriving with predictable comfort. Leisure too had its place, from games and music to festive gatherings and the growing pleasure of storytelling. The age was not only anxious, it was inhabited. The women of the dynasty, especially Mary and Elizabeth, reveal another deep shift in the national imagination. Female rule unsettled many assumptions while also proving undeniably powerful. Mary's reign carried darkness in memory because of persecution and the forceful return toward Catholicism, but it also demonstrated that a woman could occupy the throne in her own right. Elizabeth, by contrast, managed image and authority with exceptional intelligence, turning personal style, political caution, and performance into tools of stability. Under her, England felt increasingly self-conscious as a nation with a distinctive path. The island was beginning to narrate itself more deliberately. Economically and socially, the era also pushed Britain toward a new world. Trade widened, mining expanded, a more outward-looking society slowly formed. Harsh laws for poverty and vagrancy reveal how uneasy the ruling classes felt about disorder in a changing economy. To be poor in Tudor England was to live under scrutiny as well as need. Yet, the very existence of such laws shows a country wrestling with problems that could no longer be treated as merely local accidents. Population, mobility, labor, and disorder were now national concerns. Education gained renewed importance too, although unevenly and often unjustly. Boys from wealthier families were favored in formal learning. Girls were more tightly directed toward domestic roles. Still, literacy spread further than before, and schools became more visible instruments of social shaping. A kingdom that changes its church and bureaucracy also changes what it expects people to know. Written culture thickened. This would matter enormously in the generations ahead as argument, pamphlet, scripture, drama, and public opinion gathered force. There is a temptation to summarize the Tudor age through its brightest names alone. Henry, Anne, Mary, Elizabeth, yet for the voice of a sleep narrative. The more revealing images are gentler. A village hearing that worship will now be conducted differently. A household adjusting to a new prayer book, a seamstress mending by low light while court politics far away, will nonetheless alter the country she lives in. A grammar school boy repeating Latin, a market seller listening to rumors of succession, a widow hoping law or parish charity will spare her the edge of hunger. This is the human scale at which national transformation becomes real. The age leaves behind a strange residue, equal parts grandeur and fragility. The monarchy is dazzling, but always uncertain. Faith is intense, but unstable. The nation feels more coherent, yet also more capable of punishing difference. So let us notice the quieter Tudor rhythms too. The turning of a spit over a fire, the scratch of a quill, the softness of rushes underfoot, the hush of a parish church before people enter. By the time the Tudor line approached its end, England had been dramatically rewritten, not finished, but redirected. The island had a stronger sense of itself, a more centralized religious identity, a broadening social complexity, and a growing outward gaze. These changes would not settle into peace for long. The next century would test them through conspiracy, civil war, experiment, restoration, fire, union, and trade. England, and eventually Britain, was about to become a place that argued with itself more openly than ever before. The century that followed Elizabeth did not so much inherit a settled nation as inherit a nation full of unresolved energies. Religion was still a live current. Monarchy remained powerful, but no longer unquestioned in the same old way. Trade expanded horizons, print multiplied voices, and the union of crowns linked England and Scotland under one ruler, quietly preparing the ground for later political union, even as difference remained alive. Britain was not yet a calm whole. It was a realm learning how public argument could reshape power. The failed plot to blow apart king and parliament has long occupied a dramatic place in memory, but it is best understood here as a sign of a deeper unease. The country was struggling to decide what form religious settlement should take and who had the authority to define loyalty. In other words, old anxieties had not vanished with the Tudors. They had simply taken new forms. Faith, government, and fear continued to touch one another. As the Stuart era deepened, the tension between crown and parliament hardened. This was not merely a dispute over etiquette or privilege. It concerned money, military authority, church governance, and the very shape of political legitimacy. When conflict finally broke into civil war, the kingdom entered one of the most emotionally disorienting experiences imaginable. The ruler could no longer guarantee unity. Neighbors could stand on opposite sides. Old certainties dissolved. The island that had so often been conquered from outside was now cutting itself from within. Yet even civil war must not be told only through marching armies. It also belonged to interrupted harvests, anxious households, ordered soldiers, rising prices, looted stores, and the weary knowledge that ordinary people would have to endure whatever theory of sovereignty their betters chose to fight over. And after the king's execution, when the unthinkable had happened and monarchy itself seemed suddenly vulnerable, everyday life did not stop. Bread was still needed, children still cried, markets still opened. The genius of ordinary life is that it keeps going even when history seems to lose its mind. The years of Commonwealth and Protectorate can feel severe from afar, but even here, the wider culture was moving. Pamphlets, sermons, arguments, and radical ideas circulated through a society newly alert to the possibility that power could be rearranged. Then the monarchy returned, bringing with it relief for some, disappointment for others, and a renewed appetite for pleasure, theater, and visible style. Restoration England had a different mood from the grimness that preceded it. Art, leisure, and urban culture stirred again with confidence. In London and other towns, coffeehouses emerged as one of the most fascinating spaces of the age. They were warm rooms of conversation, business, rumor, ambition, and politics. A person could enter not only for a drink, but for information, for debate, for a sense of participation in a wider world. Tea, too, would gather its own rituals. New imports from global trade altered habits of taste. Spices, sugar, tobacco, tea, coffee, and exotic goods entered British life and helped reshape both pleasure and commerce. The empire of the future was rehearsing itself in the cup, the ledger, and the port. At the same time, disaster reminded the island of its vulnerability. Plague returned, fire consumed much of London, death and rebuilding followed one another with grim intimacy. Yet, perhaps that is one of the quiet themes of British history as a whole. The island is repeatedly damaged and repeatedly rebuilt, and each rebuilding changes the society that undertakes it. Streets are redrawn, institutions adapt, habits shift, memory thickens. The eventual formal union of England and Scotland in the early 18th century did not erase old distinctions, but it did create a new political frame, Great Britain, within which future expansion, conflict, trade, and identity would unfold. The significance of that union lies not only in constitutional wording, but in emotional scale. The island realm was being imagined more broadly. Its future would no longer belong to one kingdom alone. Still, amid coffee steam, political theory, imported luxuries, and constitutional rearrangement, the ordinary textures remained precious. Poor people continued to struggle for work and food. Servants lived under dependence. Women's freedom remained heavily constrained. Disease, childbirth, and bad water kept mortality close. Yet people also danced, sang, attended markets, visited taverns, listened to music, courted, quarreled, and found small pleasures in a world that was changing faster than before. It is worth pausing there, because the middle of a sleep video needs this softer ground. So, imagine a candlelit room in late Stuart Britain. Outside, the street is muddy. Inside, a kettle warms. Someone reads aloud a pamphlet or a letter. Someone else stitches by the hearth. The talk may turn to Parliament, to prices, to news from overseas, to the crown, to faith, to the prospects of a son or daughter. The larger world has entered the home, but it has entered quietly, carried by objects, printed words, and rumors shared over hot drink. That is how modernity often arrives, not with a trumpet, but with a cup set gently on a table. Soon, however, the pace of change would accelerate beyond anything these rooms had yet known. Heat, metal, coal, water, roads, and machines would begin to reorder time itself. Britain would enter the age of industry, and the island that had once lived by season and road would learn to live by factory bell, engine stroke, and smoke. Industrial Britain did not arrive all at once in a single roar. At first, it gathered in improvements that may have seemed practical rather than revolutionary. Better ways to spin thread, better furnaces, better pumping, more reliable movement of raw materials, canals cut through the landscape with patient purpose. Workshops expanded, coal grew more precious, water, and then steam turned labor into something faster, more regular, and increasingly detached from the old limits of daylight, weather, and muscle. And yet once those changes began to join together, the effect was immense. The island that had long been shaped by field, village, market town, and seasonal routine now found itself reorganized around manufacture. Extraction and transport at a scale no earlier age had imagined. New roads improved over time. Canals linked industrial districts. Steam engines pumped, turned, hauled, and drove. Factories gathered workers under one roof and one discipline. Britain entered an age in which time itself felt more managed, parceled, and owned. The industrial story is often told triumphantly, through invention and empire. But for a sleep narrative, it is more revealing to follow the body. What did it feel like to live in this new rhythm? For many, it meant migration. Villagers left familiar rural patterns and moved into towns or cities where work seemed possible. The move could promise wages, but it also meant noise, crowding, soot, and dependence on employers who measured people as part of a system. The old intimacy of village scrutiny gave way to the harsher anonymity of industrial labor. Factories had their own music, repeating clatter, belts moving, wheels turning, shouts lost in mechanical sound. In textile production especially, the work could be hypnotic from a distance and punishing from within. Small errors mattered. Long hours accumulated. Children were employed because their size suited narrow spaces and delicate tasks. Danger became routine. Dust entered lungs. Hair or hands could be caught. Fatigue could cost a finger, a future, or a life. The same inventions that made cloth cheaper and wealth greater also made labor more precarious for those nearest the machines. Mining carried the same contradiction. Coal fed the engines that transformed Britain, which meant miners worked inside the dark heart of national progress. Underground labor was hot, dirty, dangerous, and exhausting. Men, women, and children in different roles hauled, cut, dragged, and endured. Collapse, gas, flooding, poor air, and chronic illness hovered over the work. Yet to many communities, the mine was also livelihood, identity, and inheritance. Generations descended where generations before them had descended, not because it was noble, but because the household depended on it. Transport reveals another side of the industrial mind. Canals seem slow to us, but in their day, they were remarkable instruments of efficiency. Barges moved heavy goods more reliably and cheaply than older roads could manage. Then, road improvements and railways extended the revolution further, tightening the island into a more responsive system. Journeys that once consumed days or weeks shrank. Perishable goods traveled farther. News moved faster. The mental map of Britain itself changed. Places became nearer in practical time, even when they remained emotionally distant. Urban life grew around these transformations. Towns thickened into cities. Housing could be cramped and unsanitary. Streets filled with workers. Vendors, smoke, mud, and opportunity in unequal measure. New wealth rose, not only from inherited rank, but from enterprise, trade, and industrial success. That alone altered the social imagination. It became more possible to believe that money could move a family upward, even if old hierarchies remained stubbornly alive. Britain was becoming not less unequal, but differently unequal. Law and order adapted too. Industrial and urban growth exposed the weakness of older, more informal policing systems. Crime frightened the respectable, fascinated the public, and sometimes turned criminals into strange celebrities. Out of this unease emerged more professional forms of policing, investigation, and urban surveillance. Modern state authority extended itself into the street. Again, this is one of the recurring British patterns. When life accelerates, systems of control accelerate with it. It would be easy to grow too wide-eyed before the machinery of the age, so let us pause where the story is most human. Picture a canal at dusk, the water almost still, except for the movement of a loaded barge. A horse walks patiently on the towpath in the distance. A chimney marks a mill against the fading sky. Nearby, a worker returns home tired, clothes carrying dust and oil. A child dozes in a cramped room. Someone counts wages. Someone worries they are not enough. Someone hears, through an open window, the muted sound of a fiddle from a tavern. Progress and exhaustion live in the same evening. That evening is the true emotional center of industrial Britain. It was not only invention, it was adjustment. The island changed again, and ordinary people had to learn how to live upon it in new ways. They had to wake by bell instead of rooster, follow wages instead of field cycles, breathe air altered by fuel, and trust machines designed by others. Some benefited, many paid dearly, all were touched. Still, the age also produced a curious rhythm that can be strangely soothing to narrate. The repetition of labor, the hiss of steam, the turning of wheels, the patience of canal travel, the long road between old village and new town. Even hardship takes on a certain cadence when it becomes routine. Perhaps that is why industrial history can be so hypnotic in the right voice. Its world is harsh, but deeply patterned, and once Britain had built this machine of industry, it entered the 19th century with extraordinary confidence. Wealth expanded, empire broadened, technology advanced, cities swelled, yet the same pattern held every polished achievement cast a shadow made of labor, smoke, and unseen hands. No era shows that contrast more vividly than the Victorian world that followed. Victorian Britain often appears in memory as a place of confidence. Iron bridges, rail lines, museums, exhibition halls, department windows, public monuments, empire maps tinted red, photographs carefully posed, households arranged with moral seriousness. There is truth in that image. The 19th century did bring Britain remarkable influence, industrial reach, and a powerful sense of itself as a nation at the center of global exchange. But the Victorian dream is only half the story. The other half lies in the cost. Population expanded rapidly, and with it came movement. Rural people entered cities in search of work. Irish migrants fled catastrophe and hunger. Others arrived from different parts of Europe and the wider world. Britain was becoming more crowded, more urban, more connected, and more visibly unequal all at once. City life could dazzle and degrade in the same street. The Grand Terrace stood not impossibly far from a district of damp rooms, bad air, and chronic insecurity. Domestic service became one of the largest employers in the country, which tells us a great deal about the social form of Victorian life. The homes of the comfortable were often supported by the largely unseen labor of cooks, maids, nursemaids, valets, and other servants moving quietly through hallways and staircases. Industrial and commercial success did not simply produce money. It produced households arranged around hierarchy and invisibility. Comfort at the top depended on motion below. At the same time, reform gathered force. Child labor was increasingly challenged. Education widened. Certain workplace protections improved. Public health slowly became a more serious concern. Sanitation, though uneven, advanced from the terrible standards of earlier urban life. New ideas about responsibility toward workers, the poor, and the city itself began to reshape government action. Not because suffering had disappeared, but because it had become impossible to ignore entirely. Britain was learning, imperfectly, that a modern nation could not live forever on private charity and neglect alone. Technology changed daily sensation in subtle as well as dramatic ways. The telegraph shrank distance. The railway reorganized travel and expectation. Photography made faces and events strangely reproducible. Public institutions like museums and libraries offered new forms of civic life. Even the development of better sanitation and public lavatories altered how urban bodies could move through space with dignity, or at least less indignant. The Victorian period was not just an age of machines. It was an age of systems entering ordinary life, yet work remained hard, especially where the industrial base still rested on textile manufacture, mining, and heavy labor. Factory air was thick with fibers and dust. Machines were still dangerous, minds still injured and killed. The laboring body continued to pay for national strength. Reforms could soften the sharpest edges, but they did not erase the structure underneath. A nation may congratulate itself on improvement while still asking vast numbers of people to endure. That is a Victorian truth worth speaking softly. The empire adds another layer. Britain's global reach brought wealth, goods, prestige, and markets. It also drew the island more deeply into domination abroad. Tea, cotton, spice, and information moved through imperial networks that linked the daily comforts of Britain to distant labor and distant coercion. The Victorian home, tidy and respectable in its self-image, was connected through trade and power to landscapes far beyond its fireside. The world had become both nearer and more unequal. Leisure, however, expanded in striking ways. Seaside holidays, music halls, public parks, sports, theater, exhibitions, and new forms of recreation gave many people moments of release. The Victorian age was disciplined, but not joyless. Families visited the seaside. Workers saved for small pleasures. Middle-class households cultivated reading, visiting, and hobby. Public culture thickened. Britain was becoming not only an industrial and imperial nation, but also a nation of spectators, consumers, and excursionists. If we needed a soothing image from this era, perhaps it is a railway platform in light rain. A family waits with neatly packed cases. Steam gathers under the station roof. Somewhere else, a servant closes shutters in a townhouse at dusk. In a mining village, someone comes home blackened from the pit and washes in water hauled with effort. In a mill town, a mother hushes a child to sleep while distant machines finally quiet for the night. Across the country, different Victorian worlds overlap without touching. That is what makes the age so compelling. It contains confidence and fatigue in the same breath. It teaches us that national glory may coincide with private strain, that cleanliness may advance while inequality persists, that the empire of endless reach can still rest on very local weariness. Britain in this period looked outward powerfully, but the lives that sustained that outward gaze were lived in kitchens, washrooms, servant quarters, terraces, mining rows, boarding houses, and factory streets. Political life also shifted. The working class gained more voice over time. Women's claims to education, civic presence, and eventually political rights gathered strength, though not without resistance. The old social order did not vanish, but its permanence could no longer be assumed. By the end of the Victorian world, Britain had accumulated extraordinary power and equally extraordinary contradiction. It was richer and more capable than ever, yet still shadowed by poverty and dependence. It was modern and old at once, and perhaps that is the most fitting way to leave the era. Why? Not with a triumphant trumpet, but with lamplight and fog, with a train disappearing into evening, with a photograph fixed long enough to seem permanent, though the world around it is changing. Britain had climbed high, but the height itself was unstable. The next century would demand from the island something more than industry and confidence. It would demand endurance on a scale almost too large to imagine, and then a new kind of care when the wars were done. When the 20th century opened, Britain was still carrying the weight of the age before it. Empire, industry, urban growth, class difference, and belief in national capability. Then war arrived on a scale that made earlier confidence feel almost naive. The First World War drew the island into a machinery of death so vast that even industrial Britain had to redirect itself to serve destruction. Men left farms, streets, offices, mines, and mills for uniforms and trenches. Women stepped into work once coded male, keeping production, care, and agriculture alive under conditions of strain. The whole society leaned toward the front. For the ordinary household, war meant waiting as much as fighting. Letters, rationing, absence, anxiety, and names read out with dread. Work had to be reorganized. The trench, so central to memory, was only one part of the story. There were also the kitchens where news was opened with trembling hands, the workshops where munitions were assembled, the fields where labor shortages altered who worked the soil, the hospital wards where injury returned home and changed bodies. Then, after one war that was supposed to end so much, another came. The Second World War brought bombardment, evacuation, military service, displacement, and renewed collective strain. Cities darkened under blackout. Families slept in uncertainty. The island once again became a defended place, and yet ordinary routines persisted wherever they could. Tea was poured, children were comforted, laundry was done, gardens were dug, work went on. History can be enormous, but life keeps trying to become daily again. Out of those wars came not only grief and victory, but a different expectation of the state. A society that had demanded so much sacrifice from its people could no longer convincingly pretend that care was optional. The post-war creation of national insurance and the National Health Service marked a profound turn in British life. For the first time on such a scale, the nation attempted to guarantee ordinary security through shared institutions, not merely through class privilege, parish charity, or private luck. It was one of the most humane turns in the island's long story. Post-war Britain was also a place of rebuilding in the widest sense. Buildings had to be repaired, economies rebalanced, identities reconsidered. The empire that had once seemed almost limitless began to loosen and break apart. Colonies became nations in their own right. Britain did not cease to matter. But it could no longer imagine itself in exactly the old imperial frame. A country used to being the center had to practice being something else. Britain also became more visibly plural. Migration from former colonies and elsewhere changed the social fabric of cities and towns. New foods, voices, faiths, and expectations entered public life. Class remained important, but its old certainties weakened. Cultural life grew more experimental, more youthful, more openly diverse in tone. The island that had spent centuries receiving and reshaping arrivals was doing so again in modern form. None of this unfolded peacefully or evenly. Northern Ireland endured decades of violence and grief rooted in questions of sovereignty, identity, religion, and history that were far older than the moment itself. Economic crises shook confidence, strikes, inflation, unemployment, and political division marked the later 20th century. Margaret Thatcher's era altered the balance between state, market, industry, and labor with lasting consequences. To some, these changes felt liberating. To others, they felt like abandonment and dislocation. Britain was learning again that reinvention always has winners and losers. Still, the everyday texture matters most if we want to tell the story in a voice people can drift with. So let us notice the quieter post-war scenes. A doctor seeing patients under the new health service. A family in a repaired terrace house saving for a television. A child growing up in a council estate with hopes very different from those of grandparents in service or in the pits. A factory worker commuting through a city reshaped by both bombing and renewal. A newly arrived family making a home in a place that does not yet know how fully it will be changed by their presence. These are the runes of modern British history. The later decades of the century brought further shifts in Britain's place in the world. Ties with Europe deepened in some ways and grew contentious in others. Manufacturing no longer held the same position it once had. Service work expanded, finance and information mattered more. The old industrial landscapes did not disappear, but many became quieter, emptied, remembered, or repurposed. If earlier Britain had been defined by mill and mine, late modern Britain increasingly lived by screen, office, logistics, and consumption. The island had changed its tempo again. Above much of this long post-war passage stood the figure of Elizabeth II, whose long reign made her seem less a monarch than a fixed point in national weather. Around her, governments rose and fell. Colonies became independent. Passions changed, music changed, social values changed, Europe changed, Technology changed. The monarchy itself changed in how it was seen, yet her presence offered continuity of a ceremonial kind, more emotional than governing. When she died, many felt not only the passing of a person, but the ending of a familiar horizon. The early 21st century has not brought stillness. Debates over belonging, Europe, immigration, regional identity, inequality, energy, memory, and Britain's role in the world continue to move restlessly through public life. Brexit revealed how divided the country could be about its own story, whether it imagined itself as an island set apart, a European partner, a post-imperial state, or several overlapping things at once. And yet, if we let the noise recede for a moment, the deeper continuity becomes visible again. The island is still what it has long been, a place repeatedly remade by climate, arrival, labor, conflict, belief, trade, and adaptation. Each age believes itself new. Each age is new in some real way. But each age also walks on what came before. New roads cover old routes. New houses stand over older fields. New arguments echo older ones in different clothes. The history of Britain is not a clean sequence of replacements. It is a layering. Perhaps that is the hidden thread we have been following all night. Whenever the island changed, ordinary people had to learn again how to live upon it. They learned it in prehistoric camps and Roman towns, in timber halls and under Norman stone, in plague villages and Tudor parishes, in coffee houses and Mill Street, in mining rows and suburban semis, in wartime kitchens and post-war clinics, in immigrant neighborhoods and aging coastal towns, in cities wired by finance and screens. The island kept changing, life kept adjusting, so now, as we reach the edge of the present, there is no need to snap the story shut. Better to let it dissolve back into the long atmosphere from which it rose. Imagine evening rain moving over old stone walls. Imagine a train passing over ground once walked by soldiers, farmers, monks, and children whose names are gone. Imagine lamplight in London and darkness over fields in Yorkshire. Waves touching the Cornish coast, gulls turning above Scottish water, terrace streets cooling after the day, church towers and tower blocks in the same weather. Underneath all of it lie other Britons, older Britons, not dead exactly, but resting in layers. And perhaps somewhere in that layered silence, the island becomes what it has always been again. Not merely a kingdom or a state, not merely a memory of empire or a subject of debate, but a piece of earth in the mist, holding the traces of those who crossed it, ruled it, farmed it, preyed on it, worked it, fought for it, left it, and returned. The sea is still there. The wind is still there. Night gathers. Over roads new, history does not disappear. It settles softly into the ground.